Hello. Thanks for tuning in to Breakthrough Dialogues, the podcast for pragmatists and problem solvers, brought to you by the Breakthrough Institute. I'm Alex Trembath, Communications Director at Breakthrough.
And I'm Emma Brush, Managing Editor of the Breakthrough Journal.
At Breakthrough Dialogues, we sit down with some of the world's leading thinkers to talk about modern and technological solutions to environmental problems. Listen regularly and you'll learn about energy and climate change, conservation and human development, food and farming, urbanization and industrialization, and more.
If you like our show, you can subscribe to Breakthrough Dialogues on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, Overcast, or whatever your favorite app is. A quick note about this podcast for this, our inaugural episode. The Breakthrough Institute is a global research center that identifies and promotes technological solutions to environmental and human development challenges. This podcast is part of a larger commitment at Breakthrough to extend the conversations we host within our own circle to a broader audience, in an attempt to move beyond the tribalism and polarization that too often characterizes environmental thought and politics today. Our hope is that by conversing with some of the leading thinkers on the topics of food, energy, conservation, and climate, like-minded and not, we might begin to move these discourses in a more genuinely pragmatic and inclusive direction, geared toward confronting some of the world's most wicked problems and exploring novel and exciting solutions along the way.
For this episode, we talked to Charles Mann. Charles is a historian and a journalist whose books include 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus, and 1493, Uncovering the New World Columbus Created. His most recent work is The Wizard and the Prophet, two remarkable scientists and their dueling visions to shape tomorrow's world. It's a book about how humans use science, technology, and policy to confront our impact on the planet and, ultimately, our own survival as a species. Charles offered an excerpt of his book to the latest issue of the Breakthrough Journal, which you can find on our website. In this interview, you'll learn what wizards and prophets are, why the scale of a given technology might be more important to us than the technology itself, and whether humans have a special role in the universe. Charles Mann, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
So your recent work has focused sort of on humanity's place on Earth, our use of science and technology. Your recent book, The Wizard and the Prophet, is populated by scientists and authors and philosophers, including Lynn Margulis, who is a biologist who likened humanity to bacteria in a petri dish. Can you tell us who Lynn Margulis was and what she meant by that?
Well, Lynn was a neighbor of mine. She taught at the University of Massachusetts, which is just down the road from where I live. And she was one of America's foremost biologists. She won every award you can possibly imagine. And her specialty was the microworld of bacteria, protists, fungi, algae, and so forth. And one of her great insights was just how extraordinarily various, numerous, and important that they are. And in fact, mammals like us are kind of like an epiphenomenon. She thought we were cute, but not actually important, when you're studying life as a whole. And one of her most important points was that the rules of biology apply to everything. It was a kind of a second Copernican revolution. The first Copernican revolution, as you probably know, was when Nicholas Copernicus said that the Earth is not a special place in the center of the universe with its own special laws, is just a dot among all the other dots that are all governed by the same physical laws. And to her, Darwin, one of the basic ideas of evolution is that these natural processes and laws govern everything. There's no exceptions. People are not a special species in the center of the universe with their own special laws. We are governed by the same biological rules as protozoa in a petri dish. And that's the way she said, on this sort of fundamental level, there's no difference between them and us.
Would you say that there's no fundamental difference between them and us?
Well, that's the question, right? Is she right? The question is sort of more than just like philosophical. I mean, I think it's interesting philosophically. Are we somehow special? Or as she liked to put it, oh, you think you're special. Oh, how nice. Right. She said, I bet you the mosquitoes think they're pretty special too. We're the only ones that bite people and transmit malaria, right? That was her sort of thing. You can always come up with some reason you're special, but are you in fact special in some way that makes a difference?
Yeah. So what are the things that would make humanity special besides just sort of idiosyncratic traits that we have, like we walk on 2 feet or things like that? What are the things that might make humanity special?
Well, she was fond of saying that the only sort of physical property that humanity has that really is exceptional is we're really, really good at throwing. We are vastly better, I mean, by orders of magnitude better at throwing than any other species on the planet. There's just nobody that can throw like us. A baseball pitcher is absolutely unprecedented on the planet. But aside from that, she wasn't all that sure about it. And this actually, though, has some consequences, because one of the rules, in her point of view, is that most species are constrained by natural selection. You have, the environment and enemies, predators, and diseases, pathogens, and so forth keep species more or less in place. But every now and then, a species jumps over the barriers of natural selection, and when that happens, they just explode. And that's what the bacteria in the petri dish are. If you look, they just grow in this exponential, unconstrained growth. And she said, that's a successful species. You've successfully escaped natural selection, the bounds of it. And so she said, we're doing that. Look at our unconstrained exponential growth. And she said, one of the rules of biology is that these things always end badly. When the bacteria in the petri dish do this, they hit the edges of the petri dish, and then they either drown in their own wastes, or they exhaust their resources, or both. And that's the way it works. And we're going to do the same thing. One time I was walking down the street and having kind of a long face because somebody in Congress had done something really stupid about climate change. And she looked at me and said, "What's wrong?" And I told her this. And she said, "Well, duh. Do you think the bacteria in the petri dish see the edge of the petri dish coming and say, oh, we have to constrain our growth? No, they just go right and hit it." And that's what people we're going to do, too, in her point of view.
Okay, but given that we are still increasing our absolute consumption of resources, many individual resources in particular, our population growth is actually not exponential. It may have been at one point in history, but it's actually slowing, and it's likely to peak this century. We're pretty sure it's going to peak somewhere between 9 and 11 billion this century. Is that not a ironclad refutation of Lynn Margulis, or would she have a rejoinder to that?
Oh, she absolutely would have a rejoinder to that. And I brought this up with her. And she said, tell me about this when we're not trying to supply everybody in Africa with Toblerone and not trying to have enormous amounts of fossil fuels being burned to cool people all over the world and so forth. And she said, from biology, the point is, how many resources are we consuming? Is there an infinite number of resources? And the answer is no. And this is sort of a form of Malthusianism, obviously, but it was a kind of a weird form in that she didn't regard this as sort of bad and an example of humanity's greed. She just thought this is what life does. Life doesn't have an off switch.
Yeah, and this is really interesting, and this is obviously something that we focus on a lot here at Breakthrough, of how can we decouple human impacts from human well-being, both population size and resource consumption, and the productivity and efficiency of that resource consumption, which we think might be one of the things that make humans special. Obviously, we can't predict the future, but a major goal of Breakthrough and eco-modernism is to accelerate these technological improvements in our consumption so that something like a planet of 9 billion people can consume like rich people do today, but with actual decoupled and increasingly more efficient and lower per capita impacts. I want to focus on that concept a little bit and return to another metaphor in your book, the central metaphor, which is the wizard and the prophet. So what is a wizard and what is a prophet?
Okay, well, basically, on a certain level, these are the same kind of person, because they are people who are devoted to answering your question and saying, Lynn, in effect, Lynn is wrong. We can do all the things that you say. The interesting thing is that when you look at people who do try to do this, to try to sort of figure out how we can make our way in the world of 10 billion, they tend to fall into two broad camps, and I've called them wizards and prophets. Initially, when I was looking at this, I sort of got the set of ideas on both sides, and I approached a friend of mine who's a philosopher, a college roommate who's become a professor of philosophy. And I said, this side over here, what should we call them? And he said, well, that's easy. They're Schumpeterian technophiliac meliorists.
Alex.
You're like, Alex, right. And I said, oh, that's great. And isn't there some other word that I can use that, wouldn't be like bludgeoning the reader? And he said, well, that's what they're called. And and I said, okay, I'm going to call them wizards. And these are people who believe, and this is, I think, fairly closely, but not entirely aligned with the eco-modernist approach to the breakthrough, is that science and technology, properly applied, can allow us to produce our way out of these problems. We can essentially put on our thinking caps and make more. And the emblem of that is Norman Borlaug, this amazing guy who is the main figure in what's been called the Green Revolution, which is the combination of hybrid seeds, specially developed, and high-intensity fertilizers and irrigation that doubled, tripled, or even quadrupled grain yields across the world in the 1970s and 1980s, and played a large part in saving hundreds of millions of people from starvation, an enormous event in our history. On the other side are the prophets, and Bob, my friend, had an even worse name for them. I can't even. There's a big German word in the middle of it, and I can't even pronounce it. And I just thought, I am not going to write a book with many words that I can't pronounce. So I called them prophets, and they are people who argue that this approach is exactly wrong, that there's these natural limits, these natural processes that we transgress at our peril. And the figure here is there's a guy named William Vogt, who's much less well-known even than Borlaug. And he was the author of the first modern We're All Going to Hell book. And that is to say that we're just using too much and too heedlessly. And it's a kind of a Malthusian approach, except in a different. Malthus straight up said we can't grow enough food. He said we can, but we're going to wreck the ecosystems on which life depends. That's the fundamental, I think, argument of the modern environmental movement. We have to put on our cardigan sweaters and turn down the thermostat and eat lower on the food chain. In other words, sort of hunker down, because otherwise everybody will lose. And if you think about it, these approaches are quite different from each other, even though both are united in saying that Lynn Margulis is probably wrong and we can do this.
Yeah, that's what really struck me about your book, having focused quite a bit on sort of Malthusianism versus cornucopianism here at Breakthrough. But the insight that most of us humans thinking about our future on Earth actually do think that we have agency, that we are special, that we have some sort of special place in the universe. And that was fairly comforting to me, even as we're talking about a huge debate about resource use, about big global environmental problems.
Yes, you're on the same side. And one of the purposes in writing my book, I hoped, was to see that all the people who are arguing about these issues, how can we make it, are actually have this underlying unity and this belief that we are special. And in fact, this second Copernican revolution is wrong. We are not like bacteria on a petri dish, that we do have something special, and probably related to our capacity to use reason and also our capacity to transform our social organization in a way that ants can't, or other very successful social species seem not to be able to.
So, well, who are some of the individual players in the kind of modern environmental movement today that embody the dichotomy? Maybe both the kind of fierce opposition, but also this ultimate unity in the face of some sort of biological determinism?
Well, I would say that you have a whole group of people who are, primarily research scientists, but also some groups a little bit like Breakthrough that are on the wizard side. And so, for example, in the book, I focus on the International Rice Research Institute, which was the place where the rice wing of the Green Revolution took place. And it was directly inspired by Borlaug's work. The Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation put together an effort to do the same thing that Borlaug had done for wheat in rice in the early 1960s, and it was spectacularly successful. And now something like 80% or 75% of the rice grown in Asia comes from IRRI, the International Rice Research Institute. And now that's the main staging ground for what's called the C4 Rice Initiative, which is a huge international program led in Oxford to change the way photosynthesis works in rice. An enormously ambitious scientific program to dramatically increase productivity in rice, which is, of course, the world's most important foodstuff. The idea is that you should be able to grow more rice with less fertilizer on the same amount, or even maybe even less land than we are using. And so that's, I think, a kind of a perfect example of the wizard's approach. And the prophet's approach is, all kinds of things. But, on the activist side, you'd have something like the Sierra Club, which is, basically regards itself as the guardian of the world's ecosystems. And then also something like the Nature Conservancy, which is essentially trying to buy and set aside huge tracts of land so that people can't screw up the sort of vital ecosystems on which we depend.
I think that makes perfect sense. And I remember, though, reading, I think maybe a week ago or shortly after your book came out, Bill McKibben wrote a review of a very glowing review, I think, of The Wizard and the Prophet in the New York Times. I would associate him with the prophets, and maybe you would disagree, but he kind of points out that solar panels and wind power and the kind of things that we might associate more with the kind of prophet side are actually quite technological and wizardly themselves.
Yes. And the first thing I would say is that it was an extremely nice review. And the last thing I would want to do is be churlish enough to complain. No, he was very, very generous. And the other thing is what he's talking about is actually something I think I tried to clear up. This is a little bit of inside baseball, so I'm sorry to drag you into it. But he read The Galleys, of course, and a couple of people I know read The Galleys and raised the same objection. And I realized, I hadn't been clear enough. And so it's important to say that a secondary difference between the wizards and prophets is that the wizards typically favor giant centralized facilities which have enormous economies and efficiencies of scale. And so you have something like a single nuclear power plant that, if you do it right, can provide power to huge numbers of people with a very small environmental footprint. The prophets really, really dislike this. And I think that's their fundamental objection to nuclear power, even beyond the kind of prudential objections to its, the waste and the possibility of an explosion and so forth. And what they want to see is a radically decentralized vision where, lots and lots of individual scale generators like, rooftop solar, neighborhoods scale things, all swapping power back and forth. And they see that as very democratic. And, Leviathan is the issue here. And they don't like it. So they're ready to embrace technology. It's just that the kind of technology they want to embrace is quite different than what the wizards see.
Yeah, see, that's fascinating. I have grappled with this question in my mind for a long time. When I think about the difference between something like a nuclear reactor and a solar panel, both are actually highly scientific machines. A nuclear reactor splits atoms and releases energy and radiation, and it is this strange, not well understood scientific process among the general public. But sort of likewise with the photovoltaic effect, where you have photons hitting silicon, exciting electrons, and generating electric current. I don't understand what the sort of difference in kind between those two different scientific phenomena is, and why one is viewed as more friendly and one is viewed as more sinister among the general public. But what you're suggesting is it's not the science per se, it's the scale of the technology.
Yes, and this is something that I didn't make clear enough in those galleys, and I actually, the most substantial rewriting I did in the galleys was that, and I'd like to imagine that if Bill McKibben had read that, he wouldn't have. And so, from this perspective, it's no mystery that when you have things like Ivanpah, which is this huge concentrated solar power experiment that's built in Nevada, where you have a zillion mirrors focused on a tower of salt, and they melt the salt. The salt stays hot, and it boils water, and it drives a turbine and provides power to several tens of thousands of homes in Nevada. And this has been bitterly opposed by environmentalists. And you'd say, and there's been much irony, all environmentalists, they hate solar power. Or in my home state of Massachusetts, where the environmentalists are the ones who put out a giant wind power installation. And what they're objecting to is the scale. Now, maybe this is, on some level, I think you could say as a wizard, that's crazy, it's nonsensical. But once you understand that the scale and the sort of centralization and the representation of big institutions under which you don't have very much local control is what's the fundamental objection, then it's not at a surprise.
Yeah, and that is a really interesting contradiction, or at least cognitive dissonance that we find sort of all the time.
And I would like to add that the kind of blindness on this is on both sides. One of the amazing things to me is the debate over nuclear power, or the argument, or whatever you want to call it, which has gone exactly nowhere in 40 years. Mm-hmm. I mean, if some time traveler were to take you from the late 70s and pitch you up today, they would be astonished that the same people are saying the same things.
Right.
And nothing has happened. And what's really weird is that, you actually could meet in the middle. For instance, you could be talking about very, very small scale nukes. And we've built plenty of them, very small next generation nukes, and they could be presented as bridge fuels. bridge things, much as natural gas is. You could say, oh, we're going to build this and it's going to be around for 30 years and get us over the hump so that kind of photovoltaic stuff that we really like can be developed along with storage and so forth. And that idea is never presented. And in fact, if you talk to nuclear advocates, they get very huffy about it, as do the prophets. But it's clear that you could, in some sense, by being creative, meet in the middle. But people just don't want to do that.
I'm curious, Charles, do you think by creating this kind of framework of wizards versus prophets, which is flattering to both sides in different ways, I mean, also maybe unflattering as well, could that actually help bring people, self-identified wizards and prophets to the table to actually discuss, okay, well, we understand our differing worldviews through this framework, but it's time we start compromising?
Oh my gosh! Yes, that's my sneaky purpose. That's what I sort of, in the back. I mean, it's so pretentious. I really am embarrassed to admit it, but it's true. I thought if I could give how can I put it, an empathetic or some word like that view, a sympathetic word view of both of them to try to explain what I think is going on, it might make them seem less incomprehensible to each other. And that would facilitate dialogue, because I do think that the impasse in things like nuclear power or GMOs or you name it has not been productive, to put it mildly.
Yeah. So on that note, what I came away from in your writing was that there's actually at least some significant overlap in these worldviews, not just in terms of human specialness, but in that sort of cognitive dissonance about the nature of technology, the scale of technology. So I think that many of us would have a little bit of a wizard and a little bit of a prophet in all of us. What is that composition for you, if you don't mind doing some personal reflection? Are you more wizard or more prophet?
I think I'm probably like most people, which is to say I'm confused and inconsistent. I'm certainly a person that has ridden on jet airplanes like a whole lot, right? And I love living out here. So I'm, as implicated in the thing as anybody. What do I want personally? Well, I live out here. I'm a science writer, so I really, really am fascinated by science. I was totally intrigued by the C4 Rice Initiative and these other things. In fact, it was hard to prevent them from taking over the book because I was so interested in it. But at the same time, I live out here in the country, and we have a very close to zero energy home that my wife designed, and we have spaces to put batteries when they come down, so we could kind of live off the grid. Yeah. And we have a big garden. So I'm sort of torn between these two things, and I think actually that makes me, in a weird way, a good person to say. So I believe that either of these two visions could work. There's nothing that seems to me impossible about any of them, which is to say they seem equally impossible. Yeah. Again, take nuclear power. You have the vision of somebody like Michael Schellenberger, the guy who is associated with eco-modernism and is now running for governor of California. And one of his big things is he wants to have a lot of nukes. And he gives very strong environmental reasons for doing it. Basically, they are this, super safe, low impact in terms of ecological footprint form of zero carbon power, or very close to zero carbon power, to which the prophets, of course, hate it. They can say, well, look, we can't even build those two big plants in South Carolina. How are you going to have 1,000 of them built in the United States? That's impossible, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you've heard that argument. Similarly, on his side, he says, we're going to have all this renewable and build all these storage facilities that don't exist yet, and then these super complex high transmission lines to shuttle power around for weeks on end between places that are cloudy or windless for weeks on end. Oh, come on, that's impossible. Right. So it seems to me, standing back, that they both represent leaps into the unknown, and of about equivalent size. Yeah,
and it certainly seems like no matter which direction the future progresses, we're going to have some mix of technology, some mix of scale. And I wonder if that isn't a good thing if at the same time that we're producing huge amounts of corn and soy and sort of monoculture arrangements in the Midwest, and we have huge nuclear power plants and huge solar farms and wind farms in the deserts and the mountains, we also have some solar panels on our rooftop, and we also have micro reactors powering our cities, and we also have urban gardens, and we also have sort of local small scale low yield organic farms 10, 20 miles away. I'm thinking really of California right now, where I could go to the urban garden in Oakland, then I could go a little farther to the small scale organic farms in Pescadero, and I could keep driving down Highway 1 and get to Diablo Canyon, the last nuclear power plant in California. And I wonder if there isn't a virtue to all of these technologies and scales coexisting, because most people, almost no one on the planet, let alone California, are going to see Diablo Canyon, but they might be able to actually touch and interact with the human intervention at the sort of Pescadero farm scale, or they might be able to install solar on the rooftop, or they might be able to help build a small nuclear reactor in their cities, when those actually hopefully start coming online. And I wonder if there isn't some real powerful virtue into thinking of these technologies less combatively and more as part of this story that you tell, which is about these are different, and we should not pretend that they aren't, but these are all different interventions and approaches that signal human specialness.
I think that, yes, that's obviously a very humane and plausible way. And of course, it increases the system's resilience, because there will be some problems somewhere, and the less we put all of our, what is it, cherries in one bowl, apples in one barrel, what is the appropriate cliche? The less we do all the same thing, less likely we will be too vulnerable to some surprise. That said, I would point out two things about that vision. One is, I think there's going to be some mix, no matter what, but it makes a lot of difference how much is on one side and how much is on the other. The world is becoming more and more urban, and it makes a lot of difference whether the world is 70% urban or 90% urban. So that makes it the difference. And the second thing is that we've had trouble coming up with the kind of institutions, the kinds of organizations, companies, laws, regulations, and so forth that stimulate both. And I tried to talk a little bit about that in the context of agriculture, where I point out there's this farm that I went to visit that's super, super productive, quote unquote, organic farm. The reason I say quote unquote is that a lot of the very best farmers in this tradition actually don't like the organic rules, because they think of them as a kind of a snapshot of what somebody thought in the 1940s and don't have that much relevance to what we now know 70 years later. Anyway, Lloyd is this guy, Lloyd Nichols, a remarkable guy, super stubborn individual in Northwest Illinois, and he has this farm that has more than 1,000 different varieties of crops. And what he's doing is creating an artificial ecosystem, an agricultural ecosystem that has much of the complexity of a natural ecosystem. And it represents in this way an attempt to mimic natural processes and work within natural processes for human benefit. It's a huge technological enterprise, an enormous information management problem dealing with 1,000 different crops. And the information required is for each one of these is just staggering. Plus, there's a monitoring issue. Plus, there's you can just imagine it, how complicated it is to run something like that. So let's not think that this isn't an alternative form of technology, and it's highly productive. But it only exists because Lloyd is this remarkably stubborn guy who works with fanatic determination. He's gotten zero state subsidies, zero local subsidies. And in fact, his farm, from the legal point of view, it doesn't exist because there are these certain types of crops that you can get subsidies for, that you can get the loans for, that you can get the appreciation for. And he hardly grows any of them. And whereas his neighbors, who grow 1,200 acres of soy and corn, there's an entire rack of local, state, and federal mechanisms designed to help them. And they exist, kind of cradled in these institutions. And we've been just dreadful at designing institutions that will satisfy both sides. And you see it, I think, in energy with the upcoming solar war, in which utilities, who have had a whole bunch of regulations that are favorable to them, are now seeing some regulations and rules and programs come up that are favorable to rooftop solar and rooftop wind. and makes their life more difficult, and they're starting to fight against it and try to withdraw those mechanisms.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up sort of institutions and policy and practice and investment by individuals and organizations and governments. It seems like this will be a defining debate of the 21st century between wizards and prophets over how to scale, how to innovate in technology, how organizations like utilities or farmers collectives will deploy and use technology. And I think that's going to be really interesting to watch play out. My question is that all of that presupposes that we do have agency. Again, all of it presupposes that we are masters of our own destiny to some degree, even if there's 9 billion of us and there will always be some conflict there. So I guess my question is, if the opposite is true, if we're not special, then what would the practical implication of that even be? Would we cease having these debates? Would Margulis suggest that because we're ignorant and we don't know the edge of the petri dish is coming, that we just embrace that ignorance and continue living the way we're living until we collapse? Or would there be some other way to approach policy and practice that biologists or anyone who thinks that we're not special as a species would promote?
Well, I should immediately say in the answer, I'm going to tell you what I think Lynn would have said, but I didn't ask her this particular question. It's a very good question. I just didn't happen to ask her. So I'm going to tell you what I think she would have said, but of course I can't really guarantee that. And I think she would have said, no, we'll know the edge of the petri dish is coming. We just won't do anything about it. There'll be people like you or Bill McKibben for that matter, or Moniz, crying and saying, we could do this, we can do this, we can do this. And it just won't happen. And that's actually an appalling idea. It is sometimes easy to believe in when you read the headlines today.
Well, yeah, I guess on that note, on that downward note, I guess our last question would be to try to end on an upward note. What kind of progress do you see in the world today that would maybe counter Margulis's potential response to that question? What's a specific example?
I give you two answers to that. One sort of narrower than the other. Like take climate change, which is sort of the issue I think that we think of when we think of inaction leading to disaster. And most Americans or elites certainly became first aware of the possibilities of disastrous climate change in the late 1980s with James Hansen's famous testimony on Congress, and then it becomes a really a public issue somewhere in the late 1990s. So that's been depending what your point of view, either 20 or 30 years. So it's quite common to see environmentalists saying, how can we have been so slow? Why have we done nothing? And, we've had plenty of warning, right? I think you've heard this. And my perspective on this is a little weird. Take the fact that you can go to a drugstore today, a CVS, which is a big chain, at least over here. I don't know if they're over there, and buy something on the shelf. And there's a couple things about whatever it is that you're buying on the shelf for your headache or your cold or what have you. One is that there's the ingredients that are listed on the label. Probably there's a very good chance they match what's actually in the pills, right? The second thing is that it probably won't kill you. Somebody has tested it and made sure it won't kill you. And the third thing is, for most people, it will have some impact on whatever it's supposed to have some impact on. So that if you have a decongestant, it will probably decongest you. And this, right? So this is all because of institutions that were set up. So how was it set up? It began in the 1880s with the explosion in quack medicines. This is when, the idea that there could be medicines that would do something that could be made by companies came into existence. And the vast majority of them were bogus. Some of them were actually toxic, huge public outcry culminating in this country in the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And there was an enormous fight in Congress. And at the end of it, this huge dust-up, the Pure Food and Drug Act simply said that you have to have the ingredients in the bottle have to match what's on the label. They don't have to be safe. They don't have to be effective. They just have to be labeled correctly. And reformers said, "Oh my God, this isn't nearly enough." They were proven right. There's continuing big fight. They were proven right in I think it was 1938 with the elixir sulfonamide, in which a clearly, correctly labeled medication named elixir sulfonamide I think was arsenic in it. It was labeled on the there, and it killed a couple hundred people. And Congress then passed the next version of the Pure Food and Drug Act, and it said they actually have to be not toxic because the elixir sulfonamide people it wasn't possible to convict them of anything. Because they had correctly labeled it. I mean, it was incredible. They had sold poison, they had labeled it poison, and people had taken it and died, and they hadn't broken the law. But it was only in 1962 that the Food and Drug Administration actually got power to say something doesn't work, and therefore you shouldn't sell it for this. If it's a cold remedy, it actually has to do something for your cold. And so that is 80 years to get something that seems to me incredibly reasonable. Now, that is the actual scale at which things happen, I believe. Now, look at climate change. In the 30 years, we've had enormous amounts of, and very excitingly to me, there's all these local, regional, and state initiatives. You guys in California know about this. Is it the California Auto Resources Board?
Air Resources Board.
Air Resources Board, right? And the pact around that is so even if the current administration decides to undo the improved CAFE standards that Obama put in under the rules, right? The California standards kick in, and so do that. I think it's 13 states that do that. It's 40% of the U.S. auto market. Plus, the fact is that Germany, England, China, and a bunch of other countries are setting in motion the banning of internal combustion engines in cars. And Detroit has no choice. Detroit has to electrify. And, so I see things like this happening. I think this is happening with unbelievable speed compared to the standards, which is like showed with the drugs. And these are things that are actually killing people immediately, as opposed to something that's going to be a danger, decades from now. So that's one answer that I think. The second one is that I would say to Lynn. So I would say to Lynn, we are responding. Look at this is happening. She would point to Donald Trump. I'd point to all the other stuff. The second thing I would argue is that we have changed our lives dramatically in the past. And this is something I talk about in the Breakthrough Illustrated. I mean, here we are. We have this room. You and I are talking, but in fact, the producers are, I believe, two women. Is correct? Okay. Yeah, the people in charge, right? The producers, the people who are actually running the show. Or similarly, last night I had a dinner with a bunch of academics, and there were 4 women and 2 men, and the women paid the bill. I mean, this represents a change in human life that's absolutely enormous. It could have occurred nowhere on the planet in 1800. Or similarly, in 1800, that same dinner we would have had, in most places, the dinner would have been cooked by slaves or people who are a little better than slaves, and certainly washed up by them. And that's just simply extraordinarily unlikely today. So we are able to make these enormous changes in human institutions, and have done so repeatedly in the past. So this gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, well, thank you, Charles. Thank you for that up note. And thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. It was a pleasure.
Oh, I'm very interested in these subjects. I'll flap my gums about it all the time.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of Breakthrough Dialogues. If you liked what you heard, please tell your friends and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, Overcast, or whatever your favorite app is. Until next time, I'm Alex Trembath.
And I'm Emma Brush.
Thanks for tuning in.